Greetings and welcome to Theology Thursdays. We begin our study over N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope. And in the upcoming little bit, we are going to be diving into some very deep questions and some controversial questions about life after death, the resurrection. What does that mean? What did it mean? What should that mean for us now? And to get at why this question and this examination is important, N.T. Wright offers the first chapter. One might think appropriately, why write another commentary over resurrection and afterlife? Hasn't there been enough of that written already? Well, the answer is yes, there has been, but it is particularly interesting because N.T. Wright begins the book by highlighting why it is necessary for us to do a deep examination as to what exactly we as Christians believe about the resurrection, the afterlife, and what that means for us today. Because, as he points out, there is general confusion over what exactly Christian belief in life after death is. Now, the first point is very important. This is not merely an examination of whether we believe that life exists after death. Generally, in common conversation, one of the things that can sometimes be brought up is the general belief or disbelief in whether one has life after one dies. This is more of an atheism versus theism question. This is not the more specific question of what specifically Christians believe about this. Christians would fall into the theist camp that believes that there is life after death. Now, there are theists in the world that do not believe there's life after death. That's not necessarily the question N.T. Wright is dealing with. N.T. Wright is dealing with what specifically is the Christian belief in life after death. What specifically is the Christian form of believing in the afterlife? The first scene for N.T. Wright is something very specific to the British Isles, but something that was experienced in a worldwide fashion, which was the death of Princess Diana. Wright takes a look at this public display of grief, and he talks about a couple other public displays of grief, and says, look at the ways in which the general public expressed their grief in this specific circumstance. Two things Wright points out that he's going to come back to later. Number one, the offering of gifts and the writing of condolence letters, as he says, maybe somewhat tackily worded, but the response to a national tragedy, such as Diana, and he even references as well the bombings in Oklahoma in the 1990s, public displays of grief are an interesting indicator as to what exactly our society thinks about tragedy and death. The letters and things like that that talk about the belief about where Diana went when she died, or where the victims went in the 1995 bombings, reveal an interesting dynamic, which is that in people's grief in these specific circumstances, no one was saying that the person who passed away was somehow condemned to no life or was no longer existing. Rather, people expressed a level of understanding that this person has continued to exist in some way, but in a disembodied way. The belief that the victims are in some ways still alive, but disembodied in some way, becomes really clear in some of the ways that we talk about this. This person, although their body is dead, their soul is alive somewhere else. There's also another sentiment that was kind of brought up, which is that even though you don't see me any longer, I am with you in the sun, I am with you in the rains that fall, I am with you in various nature imagery in which the person's presence was understood to be spiritually present in a sort of animistic way. And Wright says that is an interesting confusion as it comes to soul and body. So the dynamic that Wright is going to bring out here in just a minute is this disembodied existence that is coming out in these public acts of grief. And we're going to examine that more closely as we go on. But that's the first thing that Wright says is an indicator as to what the wider culture, at least within the United States and within the British Isles and the Europe in general, thinks about life after death. Is that a Christian belief or not? Well, there's another circumstance that Wright talks about. As Wright points this out, N.T. Wright awakes in latter 1999 to the news that a public figure has been dismissed for public statements about their belief in the afterlife. Well, Wright, because he's an Anglican bishop, immediately is like, is this a heretical bishop that's getting dismissed? Is this a religious leader or something like that? To his surprise, it was none other than a football manager, soccer manager for us Americans, a football manager that was dismissed from his team for public statements made about his belief in the afterlife. Specifically, it was about his belief in reincarnation and that one who performs misdeeds in this life comes back with disabilities in the next life. This caused public outcry. And this manager was dismissed from the team because of his beliefs in the afterlife. Now, notice, this particular belief in the afterlife, in reincarnation, is a theistic belief, specifically associated with Hinduism, in that this karmic cycle, the good deeds done in life weighed against the bad deeds, determine the form and manner in which one returns to life in the next cycle of life. Now, there's some differences in Hindu belief, as there is differences in Christian belief about the afterlife as well. But Wright notes that people had a visceral reaction against this idea that the reincarnating cycle includes punishments for misdeeds done in this life that take the form of disabilities. Now, obviously, we can see why this is extremely problematic. But one of the things we have to note, though, is that this is just as much a cultural difference as it is a theological difference. This belief in Hinduism is not unusual. However, note the context in which this is occurring. This is occurring in the British Isles, specifically in an area that is heavily Christianized, that has certain cultural beliefs about the afterlife, in which there is not this concept that one is given disabilities, and also to note this, that disabilities in this particular case are seen as a sign of sin, or as we would call it in the Christian tradition, or a sign of misdeeds, of bad karma. There was a public outcry to this because there is a cultural heritage of understanding the afterlife doesn't work like this. Wright wants to point out that this particular belief that is very common within the Hindu religion, and likewise is very common in the understanding of karmic possibilities of afterlife, that this was immediately seen as anathema in the context of the British Isles. Wright says there's something going on with what the concept of afterlife is, but at the same time, there is still not a solid sense that what the belief in the afterlife includes is Christian or not as it comes to reincarnation. However, the reaction against this from the public keys us in that there is more going on underneath the surface. Again, there is another bit of confusion as to what do we exactly believe about the afterlife. As it comes to this particular circumstance, we know what the public certainly does not believe about the afterlife. The third scene that Wright wants to put is not a specific circumstance, but a generalized circumstance, which is the average funeral. He describes it in, this, I think, somewhat accurate descriptions. I have seen funerals done this particular way, but basically that there is a funeral that happens in which there are people who wait in long lines, come into, as he says, some tinny organ music. Some words are exchanged about the person's life. People get done with the service. The undertaker, sees people out. The person is buried. And then, as he describes, people then go home, have their cup of tea, and wonder what exactly just happened. The lack of understanding as to what exactly a funeral is really fascinating. This is a concept that pastors deal with in common day, but it's also something that can even make its way into churches, in which we don't know what we're doing in a funeral. And I think that is something that hits home for me specifically, in that what exactly are we doing when we gather for a funeral? Is the funeral for the family? Is the funeral for remembrance of a person? Is a funeral for praying for this person's soul as it goes into heaven? Is it for something else? What exactly is a funeral? And what exactly do we do in a funeral? To put it in a very blunt way, why do we have funerals at all? And for what purpose do we have a gathered community for a funeral? The confusion over this topic is something Wright wants to point out. The average person doesn't really know what the purpose of a funeral is, other than there are certain cultural inheritances, the tinny organ music, the saying of nice things about this person's life, or in some cases, the family drama over someone's life, the vague references to maybe an afterlife, maybe not. We've heard this in funeral eulogies before, right? But the purpose of a funeral, what is it? And why is there such widespread gray area in people's understandings of what exactly we do at laying someone to rest? The fourth scene that Wright wants to paint for us is one that hits very close to home for us in various ways, which is the incredible tragedies that happen in national life that are specifically involving more than simply one person. I referenced a little bit earlier September 11th. Wright uses this as a very vivid example because, again, Wright writes this book in the latter 2000s. And so this is the big global happening that happens. That, of course, starts a war in the Middle East, and that again brings up all kinds of really awful and tragic things of like people remember where they were when September 11th, 2001 happened. But the expression of the belief that this can't be the final destination or final destiny of those victims. There was almost universal understanding that this was not meant to happen, this was a tragedy, and that the victims of this particular attack were in no way, shape, or form consigned to a lesser way of life. Rather, we actually lifted up those who were victims of this tragedy. We memorialize, rightly so, and especially the first responders who gave their lives in saving people, such as the firefighters that were the first to get on scene. But we also can think about other tragedies within recent history, such as Hurricane Katrina. If you've ever been to New Orleans since Hurricane Katrina, that was absolutely devastating to that community. We can think of other natural disasters, such as the tsunami that has happened just very recently in our time, that has decimated the island of Tonga, and say that there is a general sense that we understand that there is something beyond these things that happen. That there's not simply an end to someone's life when these things happen. And that is actually seen very clearly in the fact that after these big tragedies, religious observance goes way up. In fact, not since the 1960s and prior, when September 11th happened, were churches as full as they were, which keys us in that people have underlying questions and underlying need for understanding what we think about the afterlife, especially in the cases of national tragedy, of incredible tragedy. We have a natural need and a natural intuition that there's more going on than simply this. There is an intuitive sense that when there is tragedy of this, the natural reaction of people is not that people have simply passed on from a horrible tragedy and there's nothing for them after this. Rather, there is at least some sort of underlying belief that this can't be all that there is. And we try to make meaning of all of this. Now, after the fact, we try to make other meanings than simply the theistic default. However, it should be stated that there's a reason why religious observance skyrocketed after all of these particular tragedies. And it is exactly because we have this sense and this need to have an explanation for life after death. And the fifth scene that Wright wants to put into our minds is, as he very eloquently puts, a graveyard of a different sort. Not a graveyard necessarily of people's bodies laid to rest, but a graveyard of a community fallen apart. He gives this example of this small town that one can walk to that is readily there, but that is empty, has the signs of, as he talks about, post-industrial blight, of industry fallen apart, of people no longer living there, and, as he says, this very palpable sense of bereavement, of grief, but not of someone who died or a group of people who died, but of a living community that died. A community that, as he says, lost hope. A community that fell apart because there was nothing that tied their hopes together. I'm putting my own sort of words to this, maybe in a way that you might also connect with. I grew up in rural Arkansas, small, tiny town that is a bedroom community of the larger cities that are around us. Growing up in the small town of Valonia, Arkansas, something that hits me very squarely is the fact that a lot of the life around our community was either focused on religious observance or was focused on work outside of the community, leaving large portions of the beautiful Arkansas countryside with a sense of, as one person has referred to, the depression of the rural poor. It is seen and studied and is increasingly the case that people around the United States are living in cities and moving to cities because there is simply no solid opportunities in rural areas. There's a reason why Arkansas is a flyover state. It's that state that you hop over to get to where all the stuff is happening on East and West Coast. As a native from Arkansas, I can tell you that how that makes me feel. There's not anything I can do about that. But the thing is that the smaller rural communities in Arkansas and throughout the South are communities that are suffering specifically from the same thing that Wright points out, which is that there is a bereavement of hope. What is our hope for life in the world? In our consumeristic and materialistic culture, it increasingly is chasing after the American dream. We thought that chasing after the American dream was a thing in the 60s. Boy, howdy. Did they not imagine the world that we live in the 2020s, where there is electronic media to distract us from everything, when you can't go to a place without expecting that there is going to be free Wi-Fi connection to the internet, where you sit at restaurants and look around at the surrounding people who are constantly on their phones, who need to be entertained rather than being in the actual space, the community that they're in? There is an absence of purpose that occurs in these smaller communities. I say this as someone who ministers to in the grand scheme of things, a remarkably small community in comparison to some other places. Now, in Arkansas, the city that I serve in is a relatively good-sized one. However, go just north, east, west, or south of us, and you run across communities that have 800 as their population, and communities that are increasingly empty, increasingly struggling financially, economically. People are moving away from town. We're losing population in these places, and one of the underlying things I insist is the same in N.T. Wright's circumstance as well as ours, is we have lost sight of what the ultimate hope of the world is. To maybe bring this back to a biblical example, if I might, Jesus lives in Galilee, which is multiple factors smaller than even the smallest towns that we have in Arkansas. And the 12 disciples that are named, along with the disciples who are the women and those who are the disciples after Jesus' resurrection, change the course of the history of the world because they understood where their hope is. That is by all means still possible, but we see the decay within our communities because we have lost the cohesion of what Christian ultimate hope is. That is palpable in what Wright calls the bereavement of place. This palpable understanding that there is just grief within a certain area, within a certain community that fell apart, and communities that are still grieving what used to be a vibrant place but is no longer. Which brings us in these 5 little snapshots to Wright's 2 questions that he forms this entire book around. And the 2 questions is, what is Christian ultimate hope? What is the hope that we have for the world? And likewise, the question that follows this, that's so tightly attached to this, is what does that hope mean for us in the way that we live right now? Wright insists, and I think powerfully, that Christians have always believed that their ultimate hope is intrinsically tied, inextricably, from the way that we live our life right now. And as we continue throughout this first chapter, you'll be able to see the contours as to why this is vitally important for N.T. Wright, and why I think it's vitally important for us as Christians. These 2 questions, what is our ultimate Christian hope, and what does that mean for us right now, is the hinge point in how we live ethically, how we understand things theologically, and what we find purpose in life. Is the ultimate hope for us to be caught away into heaven, away from the earth that is passing away? Is the ultimate hope that we have in the afterlife tied to whether we are good enough or not to enter into that afterlife? Is it a karmic weighing of the good or bad things that we do? Is there such a thing as a tiered system of afterlife where some have it better than others? What exactly do Christians believe about this? Because what we believe about that has everything to do with how we live in current day. Because, whether we like it or not, one of the reciprocal effects of being unclear about what Christian hope is that, number one, even the best practicing Christians might not have a solid understanding as to what the Christian hope in the afterlife is. And reciprocally, the Christians who are unclear about what the Christian hope in the afterlife is feeds into this outside community of those who don't profess the faith in Christianity, who therefore take on a cultural understanding as to what Christians think about the afterlife, and then they impose that back onto Christian communities. This is seen very clearly in the example of the football manager that was dismissed for belief in a Hinduistic karmic afterlife. The community, who are maybe nominally Christian at best, have a reciprocal effect as to what is acceptable within the wider society's understanding of what happens in the afterlife, whether we believe in the afterlife or not. And this is specifically the case when it comes to karmic belief about disabilities in the afterlife. But at the same time, there are not those with the capacity to explain why we think that this is a problem. If you actually read the literature around why the reaction was as it was specifically about the ethical things. About what does this mean ethically for how we understand those who have disabilities? Does this mean that they were bad people in the previous life? Which, by the way, Jesus encounters in the New Testament and rebuffs this idea. I just want to point that out. But the thing is that reciprocal relationship of Christians not having a clear understanding as to what that is feeds into the general understanding that Christians believe X about this when Christians don't. So Wright wants to be able to be clear about this because the world is confused about this. And if we as Christians are confused about specifically what the Christian hope is, the world will impose and imprint upon Christian communities whatever the world thinks that Christians ought to think about certain things. And Christians have no recourse to be able to say, no, that's not exactly right. So we have to get clear about the confusion of the world, the outside communities that are not Christian, and we have to get clear about our own confusion as to what we actually think about the afterlife, what we actually think happens when we die. Because those two things will feed into each other. And the more they feed into each other, the more that the confusion will grow. So with that in mind, we need to dive into what exactly the confusion of the world is as it comes to religious belief about the afterlife. Because again, one of the things that we are going to have to deal with as it comes to specifically the communities here within the United States, within England, within Europe more widely, one of the things that we have to get past is that Christian belief in the afterlife is not merely belief that there's life after death. Because guess what? There are an abundance of religious belief about life after death. The Orthodox Jew believes in life after death. They have a distinct belief that is different from the way that Hindus understand life after death, which is distinct from the way that Christians believe in life after death. But if we don't become clear as to the differences between religious understandings of afterlife, then all of that religious muddle gets imposed upon each of the religions. Take, for example, Wright's story about this one anthropologist, Nigel Barley, who had a friend that he had made, a Japanese colleague, highly educated Japanese colleague, that had accompanied him while he was doing anthropological work. The differences in cultural understanding between this anthropologist and his friend, a highly educated Japanese scientist, the differences in cultural understanding about death was very starkly put in one of the stories that he tells. Listen to this particular account. Barley comments, "He was, of course, a Buddhist who had a shrine to his departed parents in his living room, on which regular offerings were made. He had taken to Africa some bone from his dead father's leg, carefully wrapped in a white cloth to ensure protection during his field work. For me," Barley comments, "ancestor worship was something to be described and analyzed. For him, it would be the absence of such links between the living and dead that would require special explanation." So, putting into perspective, this highly trained Japanese scientist, the absence of this connection between the living and the dead would have been something far more notable to this Japanese scientist than for Barley, who would say that this interesting connection between the living and the dead was something to be anthropologically analyzed. Well, what exactly does this culture think about the connection between living and dead? It was exactly the opposite for this particular man, who was a highly trained, highly educated person who actually would rebut this anthropologist and saying that the weird thing was not that he believes in the connection between life after death to the living, but rather that this anthropologist did not see the intuitive connection between these two things. So, once again, this puts it into our faces very clearly. We have a very inherited understanding of this bifurcation between living and dead that is simply not the case for a lot of the wider world. Once we get outside of the Western United States and European context. This example is something that Wright uses to jump off on, which is that the Western aversion to talking about anything related to death is something that needs to be carefully understood. We'll talk about this in later chapters, but he wants to point out that this unmentionability of death and this aversion to anything that has to do with death and dying is something that we actually see within both wider practice and within church practice. Something changed in the 1700s, where all of a sudden this aversion to anything related to death, and even the not knowing how to answer a child's basic question of, where's my grandpa? Where did daddy go? Where did mommy go when she died? Not being able to answer that, and also having an incredible anxiety about those questions. If you got anxious about any of those questions, understand that that's a key for us to recognize something's going on that we might not have a good understanding of what it means for life after death. And this aversion to death was, as Wright says, one of the theological interesting things about the 20th century. As it comes to life after death, in the aftermath of the Great War, World War I, one of the theological casualties, as he says, is really the belief in hell. And the reason why this is really important, and you can read this in C.S. Lewis as well, who lives contemporary to these times, one of the things that happens is that there was so much hell on earth that this belief that there was somehow something worse than that awaiting one after death happens, that there was either a widespread aversion to even thinking or conceiving of that, or, as Wright, I think, rightly points out, there was an underlying deep grief because there was not a clear answer as to what happens to these poor people who go through this awful war and what happens to their souls. There has to be something eternal about the person that then is taken away from the suffering. That there is no longer suffering that this person has to go through, and that the meaning of this person's life, thinking about the victims of the Great War or of World War II, or dare I say Auschwitz, that the soul of this person is something that continues on in incorruptible ways and in ways that do not suffer. It's a big deal in this particular understanding, but is that specifically Christian? Well, we need to get clear that there are a variety of beliefs already in this amalgam. The example of Barley and his Japanese friend. The example of the aversion to talking about death in the 1700s, especially in the British Isles, especially within the wider context of the US, and so on and so forth, especially in the ways in which we can't stand to think about these questions. And also in the ways in which we have gone through periods of intense suffering and that we have this understanding that these people who die are removed from suffering. Surely they are removed from suffering. Well, that belies the fact that there are a variety of beliefs about life after death. The varieties of belief that can be seen within the wider culture, not necessarily the religious, can be summed up in the literature and also in the poems that one can sometimes see from these particular ways of understanding what exactly it is that we're dealing with when it comes to life after death, or if there is at all. I'm going to read you several excerpts that Wright points out as driving this confusion. If not driving the confusion, at least is indicative of the confusion. The first is going to be from Dylan Thomas in writing this famous line with an angry outburst at the death of his father. Listen to this famous line. "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." This particular line in the wider work that this is referenced from is a reference to this idea of annihilation. That, in other words, the passing of someone on is a passing into oblivion. There is this idea of raging against the dying of the light, of trying as hard as possible to escape death, which, as it comes to modern medical practice, this is a creeping sort of thing that is understood within medical communities. I, as someone who served as a chaplain in some of our medical communities, that there is a pressure to save life at all costs. But annihilation is not the only concept that we deal with life after death. Take, for example, Will Self in his book, How the Dead Live. Now, to set up the scene in which this happens, there's a woman who has been told that she will be condemned to a life of constant reincarnation unless she's able to grasp the concept of what's called the hooks and eyes of grace. Notice the reincarnation aspects that are played within it. Here's a line from this particular writing. "Still one last chance to get off the go-round, girl, still time to attach you to the hooks and eyes of grace, if you want it, if you can just, even for a few instants, achieve a one-pointedness of thought." But after this line, the woman doesn't discover what the hooks and eyes of grace is, and she is reborn. And in fact, in this particular literature, she is reborn as an unhappy baby that is destined to a brutal and short life. Vivid sorts of pulls of understanding of parody in this idea of a reincarnative cycle. Whereas in the case of Glenn Hoddle, the football manager that was dismissed because of this reincarnative idea, here's something that puts it directly in our faces. And that this is, in some cases, a stark and scary contrast of what life after death is in this kind of imaginative circumstance. But there also is, perhaps more widely, the sort of warm New Age sort of ideas of life after death. Again, this is the thing that comes up in Princess Diana's funeral that we talked about, which is that one is not truly gone. They are within the more animistic side of the world, such as this anonymous poem from Northern Ireland. Take a listen. "Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. I am 1,000 winds that blow. I am a diamond glints in the snow. I am the sunlight on ripened grain. I am the gentle autumn rain. Do not stand at my grave and cry. I am not there. I do not die." This understanding that the person is no longer where the final resting place is. They are somewhere else. But not just somewhere else, they are no longer dead. They are eternal. But eternal in a specific sense, right? They are eternal in the sense that they are not gone. Princess Diana, this was one of the sentiments at her funeral, but that this idea of a amalgamistic sort of idea that someone doesn't die after death, but we're just not sure what exactly happens, that they are caught up into the wider ecology of the earth. But not just the ecology of I'm no longer here. As Wright points out, the interesting reappearance of gifts given to the dead. Now, if we think about Barley and his friend and his Japanese scientist friend, the practice of leaving gifts for the dead is widely seen within a lot of different cultures. But in the West, this has started to creep back in as a common thing you'll see at funerals. Now, while this is not something you will necessarily see at Christian burials, this is a much wider practice than you might think. The giving of items that were important to the person, and in this one really kind of farcical example that N.T. Wright gives of the giving of the spray adhesive that this one man used to keep his toupee on before he goes into the crematorium. And when he goes into the crematorium, the cans ignite and explode. It's one of those, if you're not crying, you're laughing at these things. What does that say about our thoughts about what happens in the afterlife? But in this final example that Wright gives in this chapter, the kind of popular examples of connections or belief that one can communicate with those who are dead. The widespread belief in ghosts, in the dead who inhabit spiritually disembodied in these places, such as the use of people doing seances, and not to even talk about the myriad of TV shows that you can find on that have to do with spiritual things, ghosts, contact with them, things like that. There is a cultural heritage that there are disembodied spirits that inhabit the world that you can communicate with, that are dead relatives and things like that. What does that tell us about what people believe about the afterlife? If some people come back as ghastly figures tied to certain aspects of the world that can't move on until they're released by physical means, or until they are laid to rest in a ceremonial sense, what does that tell us about the wider belief of the world? So, in this first chapter, Wright simply wants to paint a picture for us. We live in a world that is profoundly confused about what different people believe about the afterlife, but not confused about whether there is an afterlife. That's, again, a question that this book is not necessarily going to answer as it comes to the secular versus religious. The question that comes in is, what specifically do Christians think about the afterlife? Do Christians think that there are disembodied spirits that one can communicate with? Do Christians believe that there is a removal of one's soul from this mortal coil that goes off somewhere where there's no more suffering? And what do those beliefs tell us about the way we live right now? That's the landscape in which Wright is going to be writing into. This is the general description of the trajectory of what we're going to be dealing with. Over the next couple of chapters, we're going to be examining very specifically, what do Christians really think happens in the afterlife? Why do Christians think that certain things happen in the afterlife and certain things do not happen? And where exactly do these beliefs come from that seem so intuitively Christian, but really are not? Widely held beliefs that we might have inherited from where we come from, but really have no biblical basis and also don't make sense in the light of the New Testament. Wright is going to bring his heavy-hitting biblical scholar's hat to the New Testament texts that we deal with, and we will really dig into deeply what Christians have believed, why that's important, and how that ultimately affects the way that we live in common modern day and how we should live differently than perhaps we live right now.